it's time for our next panel. So as the panellists, who I hope are all mic'd up, make their way to the stage, I welcome Kiri, Mark and Ilan, please. Thank you. And while they come up and get themselves settled in, I'll introduce them very briefly. You can check out a more robust bio on our website, of course. So 4 questions. I do want to remind you we're using Slido, so please put your questions in there. I will ask them towards the end of the panel. So today we have Kiri Dell, who is an inspirational wahine, hailing from the east coast, Te Tairawhiti, specifically Ruatōria, and juggles all the things and manages to work on her own whenua, koina te moemoeā, that is the dream, a senior lecturer in the University of Auckland Business School, and Kiri is working towards her ultimate goal of progressing Indigenous entrepreneurship and prosperity. Tēnā koe, Kiri. Kia ora. Yep, kia ora. Hi, whānau. Ilan. Am I on my lapel, bro? Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. We've got too many mics. Oh, am I on my lapel now? Kapai. Just some sound, just some teething issues, whānau, to get us ready for the day. Kei te pai, it's all good. Okay, Ilan Noi, no mai ki te Aotearoa, is one of our New Zealand's leading economic thinkers on adaptation and chair of economics of disasters and climate change at the Victoria University. No mai Ilan. Maki maki, come on, make them feel warm. And we have Mark Baker-Jones, who has worked extensively as a climate change policy advisor to governments in Australia and as political advisor to our own climate change minister. And he has a climate law background and now has a climate advisory consultancy, Te Whakahaere. No mai, Mark. Okay, can I hear all good? Bye-bye. Oh, kia ora koutou, no mai ki te Aotearoa. And has everyone got Slido sorted? Ka pai? Cool, sweet. Just so that we can, if you get bored of me, you can ask your own questions. Look, ka pai. Now, many are struggling to reconcile the scale of the climate adaptation challenge with the way our decision makers have to think about costs, which seem to regularly understate the true state of play. Now, while some of this is due to the difficulties of modelling and costing climate impacts, there is also a deeper note regarding how we, as a society, value our history, culture and natural environment, o tātou taiao. Now, speaking of cost, i te tuakana e Kiri, you've been developing an Indigenous theory of value that you've named Manaho. I think that will kind of set us in good stead to understand and get our heads into this space. So can you explain this concept, Manaho, for us in plain terms?
Oh, kia ora, tātou. Well, first, I just want to acknowledge my co-panellists and mihi to you both in the expertise and the mātauranga you bring to this space. And also, I'd like to acknowledge Jason Mika, who is one of the lead drivers of this idea around Manaho. And Manaho is about bringing into the conversation the unseen energies that reside within our human existence. And these unseen energies are very explicit in the Māori culture. We acknowledge these concepts such as mana, mauri, wairua, hau. All these unseen energies are entwined with our ideas of economies. So Māori don't just focus on the physical or tangible attributes of our existence, but we also embed these unseen energies. So that's what Manaho is. It's about bringing that part forward into the conversations of economics.
How have those conversations been traversing in the spaces in which you are in?
There seems to be quite a lot of appetite. We're always, Jason and I are always getting caught up to talk around Manaho from government entities and policy makers, so the appetite's pretty high. Yeah.
Appetite high, but in terms of the implementation at that policy level, are we seeing, can you see it be embedded in the way in which, for our, our mātauranga and these sorts of concepts, how do you and Jason ensure that when it is taken or when it is being put into place, it's being put into place in the right way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. How do you, first of all, how well can our concepts, Māori concepts, travel into other cultures? We have to get a really good and in-depth understanding of that. Some of them travel better than others. Some of our Māori concepts are more suited to our context in Te Ao Māori, but some of them do have high travelability. I think mana's one that does travel very well. And then you need to ensure the safety, that the essence of that kaupapa is maintained when it travels into another context. And I think there's lots of ways we can think about that, but Māori are the kaitiaki of those whakaaro, that mātauranga. So we always need to be involved when those concepts are being developed in other cultural contexts.
Now, a recent Treasury report says, somewhat surprisingly though, that the New Zealand's economy is resilient and well placed to handle climate change. Ilan, I do want to come to you on this. Now, you have been pretty vocal that our estimates in general of the costs of climate change fall far short. So could you just walk us through Treasury's findings and your take on their approach?
Yeah. Thank you, Mani. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm an economist, and I apologize for that. So
There's a couple of them in the room. You're right. You're not on your own, bro.
I'm counting numbers, right? So I'm not recognizing a lot of the other values that need to guide us, but they're only one input into what we need to decide. So whenever we need to make decisions about climate change, this is one aspect that we need to consider. But by no means do I want to imply that this is the only aspect. Treasury came out a few weeks ago with a report on climate change. I think in some ways this was a heroic attempt to try and quantify something that we haven't spent enough effort quantifying until now, and we now realize that we don't actually know what is the impact of climate change in New Zealand. To a large extent, in the last decade, maybe we were looking a lot at climate change and at sea level rise, and the examination of sea level rise was a bit like looking at the keys under the streetlight rather than actually where the keys are, because sea level rise is easy to think about, easy to conceptualize, easy to model, and easy to forecast. And extreme weather events are much more difficult for the scientists to handle, so we ignored them and we focused on sea level rise. And it is actually in extreme weather events where the impact of climate change is largely manifesting here in New Zealand, and we've seen that tragically this year. So this year, if you look at the past data, the sort of incomplete data that we have about insured damages from extreme weather events, the last few years have each one of them broken the record in terms of the cost of, again, insured damages, and I'm emphasizing insured here because that's the only number we know. We don't know how much uninsured damages we are incurring every year. Not because I think insured damages are more important, by all means. But this year, 2023, is already 3 times as high as the worst year ever that we had in terms of insured damages. Already 3 times higher. So we are looking at an acceleration of the cost of extreme weather events that is incredibly fast, and much faster, I think, than what our modeling predicted. And to some extent, the Treasury report and most of our other efforts in the past decade have ignored that risk. And I think that is the main issue that we need to deal with, and that is extreme weather events and how do we deal with them, how we deal with the impacts, and how we adapt and prevent them from continuing to expose us this way.
What did you think of some of Coco Warner's concepts that she touched on around the frameworks, those 3 frameworks?
Well, unfortunately, we didn't quite let her to
the concept of time, stewardship, and connectedness.
Yeah, so these are all clearly very, very important for our for our policy decisions in terms of climate change. They're not going to help us in trying to conceptualize what are the current costs already or what the costs are going to be in the future. But in some respect, we also need to think creatively about ways to actually measure things that we are not measuring right now. So I already mentioned uninsured costs. We've had discussions this morning about the impact on mental health, for example, from extreme weather events, and that's something that we haven't quantified at all. We haven't quantified at all the cost of very slow recoveries that we have been experiencing. So one of my colleagues here, Belinda, just showed me, noticed yesterday that in the current budget, there is still a line item for recovery of Christchurch from the Canterbury earthquakes of 2011. So if we are still spending money on recovery from 2011, then we have a problem in terms of making sure our communities recover fast. And we know that slow recovery entails mental health challenges. So there's a lot of things we need to quantify in terms of the connectedness of all these systems.
And just on that point, Mark, I'll come to you. Have you ever had to try and put a number on something unquantifiable in your adaptation mahi?
Tēnā koe mani, ko kekitea te rākau. So, e mihi ana hau kia koutou, tēnā koutou. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and to my fellow panellists. So the work I'm doing at the moment is not so much in the adaptation space, but more around transition risk and disclosure of climate-related risk. And so for any of you in the room that may not be aware or may know a little bit about, we have in place for businesses, for some of our financial institutions and listed corporates, a requirement now that they report annually in their financial filings on the impact of climate change on the financial impacts of climate change on the organisations, which sounds really complex, and in some ways it is incredibly complex. And this is going to be a long answer. Are we okay if I take the long route to this? But
yeah, I'll cut you off when I need to.
Yeah. So under that regime, we've got about 200 organisations in New Zealand, and it's all our banks and our insurers and entities listed on the stock exchange who have to report on the impacts of climate change. And to support them, we have climate accounting standards which were developed by the External Reporting Board, the XRB, to give them support. But what we don't have, unlike our sort of regular financial accounting that we're very familiar with, we don't have that full accounting cycle. We don't have all the procedures and processes and the rules that are necessary in order to carry out that accounting. We just have the standards at the end. And if you expect many accountants, you say, what's the accounting cycle? And they can map it out for you. In terms of climate change, when you're doing your filings on the risk, we don't have that accounting cycle. So what that means is these organisations who are required to report are sort of making up this landscape as they go along. And that's incredibly challenging. So at the moment, and ultimately what they've got to do is look at all these risks, quantify them, and then cost them. And this is where Elan sort of work sort of comes into play. At the moment, we're right at the beginning of this process, even though we've got a report this financial year, trying to work out what that landscape looks like. So organisations are really struggling. There's a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of expertise going in to try and develop this landscape, with the understanding that at the end of it, they've got to cost it, but no idea how to cost it. We can look at the physical risks. We can cost some of those, like if a bridge washes out or infrastructure, we can look at what sort of cost that will be on an organisation. We can look at the cost of carbon, so our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and and some sort of rudimentary tools around scope 3. But what we call the transition risk, where an organisation is changing from being heavily reliant on carbon, either as it's part of its business or it uses fossil fuels, to getting to a point where it's not reliant on that. So the risk associated with that, we are at a complete loss at how to cost that at the moment. So in we're looking at a bit of a catastrophe on the horizon where everyone's focusing on procedure at the moment, knowing we've got this big issue of costing at the end, but have no idea what it's going to look like.
When you say catastrophe, I mean, a lot of the language around, what we're facing is quite, it's very scary. And I mean, like, Kiri, I'll come to you on this around, especially on the East Coast and what we've just seen with Gabrielle, when we think about that process of having to get to that point of how we look at that cost, and obviously that the podcast was a good point on talking about unpacking that with Sean and Jen Margaret in that second episode. But Kiri, for the East Coast, it is literally on your doorstep. How is the community, when we talk at this kind of level, how do you see it kind of trickle down in terms of how that can be tangibly applied into these communities when we're talking about the cost? What is that cost?
Well, I think I've actually struggled with the word cost. And thinking about climate change in terms of cost. And after our major cyclone impacts and devastation into our communities, the question now I think we're asking is, how should we live? Or how should we think about living? Because now we are starting to accept that these impacts are coming at us hard and fast. We now have to rethink about our energy alternatives. How are we going to feed ourselves when we're cut off like islands? So we are starting to think probably more how our ancestors used to live in more smaller communities, more intimate communities, looking how we're going to grow food to feed smaller communities so that when these impacts happen, we are ready for it. So the question we're asking ourselves is, how should we now live?
And I mean, that speaks very, very much so to that concept of Manaho, as you've already touched on. And you've talked about that economy of mana and economic system influenced by that mana enhancing interactions between people, te taiao, the environment. Do you see this concept, I mean, when you talk about that, that's literally what you're talking about on the ground. How is that translated on a bigger scale across Aotearoa?
So I think you're starting to touch on the point that a lot of the way we've been conceiving or perceiving of climate change has been quite fear-based. These things are happening to us, they're coming at us, we're almost victims of it. And I just started having some very kind of general loose thoughts this morning about that. And for Māori, that fear-based, the word might be matakuwe. And what is the opposite or the flip of that? Well, it's probably mana. What is a mana approach to dealing with impacts that are coming at you? And so I think that's something we might be able to think about and tease out a bit more in our conversations.
Yeah, and I want to come back to you, Mark, and then I'll come to you, Ilan, around, Kiri's point of kind of, as Māori especially, reconciling with that word cost in this particular context. Can we flip it? Can we make the narrative, just totally flip that narrative of cost? Because I think that's where people kind of hit a wall a little bit, right?
Absolutely. Kiri, you're so spot on. Like, for even with the organisations that we deal with, if we talk about risk all the time, it's like saying there's a catastrophe on the horizon. Like, we always look at it and say it's an opportunity. It only becomes a risk if you leave it too late. So the conversation we're having, even though organisations have to report on the financial risk from climate change, if you only talk about risk, organisations just get mired in fear, and they end up just pushing the problem away because it becomes too complex. But exactly as you say, Kiri, if you start talking about the positives, about the mana, about what we're trying to do is to realise an opportunity that completely changes organisations. And I'll give you an example. So we had a discussion group of a group of general counsel from some of our biggest organisations the other day, and one of them said, "I'm having such a battle because reporting on climate change is really within the organisation. It's really disrupting us, and so." If you understand what we're trying to do through reporting on climate change, we're actually trying to avoid financial instability, because we've got a risk sitting there. It's not a fictitious risk. It's a risk sitting there. If you don't recognise it and you don't do something about it, as an organisation, it will cause instability. And the longer you leave it, the greater that instability. So if you recognise it and act on it, you're actually mitigating the instability of your organisation. And changing that conversation around for an organisation who at that point was saying, oh, this is such a hassle, we've got so much on our plate, to go, actually if we do this, we're going to be better off as an organisation. It's that empowerment. And then they really embrace this process and they see what it is, and they take advantage of those opportunities. So absolutely, I think, and this probably Kapa will understand this from being in the military, is that, you know, when the military, on the movies I see, they go in and they say hearts and minds, you know, is what you're trying to do. And I think one of the biggest problems we have with climate change is we haven't captured the hearts and minds of the people effectively to mobilise them to respond to climate change. All we've done is talked about the fear and the issues and, you know, how bad it is. And so we've sort of turned everyone off. So I think if we are, like my big philosophy on this, if we are to make progress and we are to sort of do it in time, we've got to change that conversation. We've got to look at those concepts of, you know, whakapapa kaitiakitanga that are becoming universal through the climate change language, understand what they mean, and use those positive aspects to move. So absolutely, it has to flip.
I'll just add,
Yeah.
but the idea of mana is you have agency, that you are empowered to act. So I do think there's something there for us to explore with regards to responding to climate change.
Elaine, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm an academic, and I see my role as a.
You feel like you have to keep it.
So I'm not about inspiring people. I'm about researching, and maybe also because I'm Jewish, I'm a bit sort of a pessimist. I understand the argument, but I also think we need to highlight that there are very significant costs and very significant impacts. We don't need doomsday language, and I think, for example, the organization Extinction Rebellion is doing very good things, but the name extinction implies you know, something terrifying, and I don't think we are looking at climate change causing extinction of us as a human species, although it is causing extinctions for a lot of other species. But I think, yes, we need to be inspirational and we need to be positive, but we also need to acknowledge the fact that if we are causing businesses disruption, that's exactly what we want to cause. We want to, you know, stop business as usual. And
change, not disruption.
Yes.
That's what we're trying to do.
But maybe disruption generates behavioral change. I don't know. But I think we need to, yes, we need to make sure that we convey the message that we can climb out of the hole we've dug ourselves into in the last 100 or so years. But it does entail significant pain, and I think sometimes we don't acknowledge that there is significant pain involved. I'm going to give you an example. We have a cost of living crisis in New Zealand. So one thing the government did is relax the ETS rules so that the cost of emission trading units dropped down from $90 a ton to $51 a ton as of this morning. That's very unfortunate. Yes, you know, if we'd still been at $90 a ton, that would have entailed some challenges in terms of cost of living, but we should have dealt that not by relaxing our emission targets, but rather with other tools. And Treasury and the government has plenty of other tools to assist with the cost of living crisis. So I think we still need to acknowledge the fact that this is a major crisis and we need to be proactive about it.
Yeah, Kiri.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting. What is the role of fear in disrupting behaviours? And I'm not quite sure about that, but what I am interested in is how we go about experiencing what is happening to us in climate change, and acknowledging that there's lots of big numbers involved.
How do you strike that balance, Mike?
I think it's not sugarcoating. Like, absolutely, you've got to acknowledge the consequences of our current and previous actions and what that means if we don't act quickly on this. And and there's a lot of built-in consequences already, those negative things. But and so I don't believe we should sugarcoat it. But that's not the solution, just telling that story. The solution is, what are all the actions that we're going to take now to, what are those behavioural changes that we're going to go through now to find a solution? So I think, absolutely be aware, but the balance, look, if you don't know that climate change is putting us in such a, we're sort of heading towards disaster, if you don't know that already, I don't think you're ever going to get that. But we all do. We all do that. The thing we've got to do is understand what in our lives, like what can we do, or what do we do as a globally in order to find a solution to that. So I'm saying that's where the focus should be. So maybe it's a shift of conversation. Maybe we've just reached a point of maturity now where we go, yeah, absolutely, we get this, but we realise we have to do something. We have to act upon
it. Given your work though in policy, law and policy in this space, what big shifts can you actually see working? Because we're talking about these kind of two things that are on the same spectrum, right? The literal cost and then the impact, right? If we wanted to think about that as a spectrum, but what will work if we want to have those shifts happen and those paradigm shifts happen through the levers such as law and policy? So
I think we've got great policy frameworks. Already a great policy framework in New Zealand at the moment. It will always have to change and evolve and develop. And if you look at what Australia's doing now, like they've learnt from us, and they're introducing policies that we hadn't really thought of, but are sort of the next step on. When we developed a lot of our policy framework here, we were looking at the UK and the EU and seeing what they're doing, and we built it up. And there's some contextualising for the local environment, but it's progressive. But the principles in that are really good. The failing is in implementation of those policy, because they all rely on decisions of our key decision makers, our politicians, and our businesses, and not blaming the politicians, because politicians are put in place to represent the people that put them in. Yeah, but if you look at their role, they're there getting votes. So I mean, they're sort of how these decisions are manifesting, but they're not the sole source of that decision making. It sort of comes back to all of us to say, it's unacceptable that government in November last year acted in a way that kept that price down of the ETS, because on the false premise that it was going to impact on households in some detrimental way if it did. And we clearly know it wouldn't have. It would have some impact, but it would be negligible. But that's a political statement that's coming through, and I use that in the crude term, rather than a truly economic output from that. So we have to not tolerate that sort of behaviour from our decision makers. We've given them mandate by putting them in there and giving them support through responses to the policy when it was put out for consultation. Now we have to hold them to account to drive hard on that. And I don't think we're doing that. I think we're probably all to some degree not demanding enough of our politicians in that.
Yeah, Elan, go.
Can I add something? That specific decision about the ETS, I think it's hard to explain that as a way to garner votes, because the vast majority of voters in New Zealand have no idea what the price of the ETS is, or what is even the ETS. I think we're talking about small interest groups that have been lobbying the government and have got that go through. So I think I'm a bit more cynical there. Again, maybe my role as an academic is to be a bit cynical.
On the use of the word household, it's not fair on households. We're in a cost of living crisis, and the way I saw it was government saying, we're actually out there to look after the households. We realise we're in an economic crisis, and we'll take this action, even though they don't understand the connection between the two.
But they could have equally said something else, and we're taking that action. Like, in the US, they did a very aggressive climate change bill and called it the Inflation Reduction Act, in some jiu-jitsu of language. We can, be a bit more creative about that, rather than actually shoot ourselves in the foot with the decrease in the ETS. I also want to add something else in this discussion. So we are definitely moving in the right direction, in the sense that we are much more acknowledging the problem. So the budget that came out yesterday mentions the word climate change 81 times in a document of 150 pages or something like that, so that's quite impressive. On the other hand, it also includes a funding for Westport stop banks, and maybe worryingly says that the spending on stop banks in Westport could be an example for future adaptation in other communities around New Zealand. And I think anyone who has looked at Westport knows that this is an unsustainable policy decision. So we're not quite putting the money where our mouth is at this point in time. And yes, we are talking the talk a lot more than we have before, but we're not quite spending in the right directions, I think.
Yeah.
Kiri, when Mark said, we do have these great policy frameworks, it took quite a long time though for the government to actually incorporate a Māori at that table in a meaningful way. And then, with the appointment of the Ropu last year, with Mike and Dale at the helm. Mike Smith and Dale Takatumu. But do you think that our policy frameworks are fit for purpose for Māori, for our Māori communities?
So I'm not heavily involved in the climate change space in terms of understanding the policies that are being put out there, analysing the literature or research. And I told the organisers this. But I consider myself more as a receiver of what is happening, of the narratives that are coming at us. So, I think my perspective is really in the small community perspective.
Yeah, if we want that perspective, that's
how do we now think about conducting ourselves amidst all this chaos, and how do we maintain our mana, our strength, our dignity to live with these oncoming impacts?
I might go to Slido for some pātai before we wrap up. I'll just grab save paper and things like that. But amazing kōrero. And stop apologising for being an academic. It's okay. It's all right. There's lots of views in here. So in terms of some of our pātai, I hope you guys have been getting amongst. Okay, first pātai, it's not to anyone in particular. How can the government take into account long-term cost of climate change in their short-term policy interventions? Mark, I might come to you on that one.
So the question is a question that government has short-term goals, but this is a long-term issue? Is that a
the government take into account long-term cost of climate change in their short-term policy interventions?
Yeah, so I think there was an attempt to do this, and kudos to James Shaw for getting all this work through, where setting up this policy framework, and just on that point, it's not perfect and it needs to evolve. And in terms of Māori participating, when we're using terms like kaitiakitanga or these have particular nuances and meanings that you just can't take that word and then say, we're just going to use it. What we're doing is we're kaitiaki, and you said it on the aeroplane when you come down here or come up here. You just can't take that term and make it mean something. So it's really important, I think, if we're going to adopt this way of thinking, then we have to adopt the people into the decision at the table who think this way, who know how to wield these tools. And that's been a massive failing, not just in climate change, it's been a failing in New Zealand policy forever. There's a failing to do that. Issues with co-governance, all that misunderstanding of what those relationships and things are all part of that. But the policy framework was set up with a view to sort of longevity of those policies. So, and I call it a framework because the idea was that the real decision making should lie outside of government. By framing that, like the Climate Change Commission, for example, was appointed to do the hard work and to provide advice to government. So government didn't really have to make the decision. I think where the failing has occurred and why we're seeing that short-termism is that the government is not accepting fully that advice from the Climate Change Commission, and it's again putting that sort of the twist on it, whatever the intention is there. So that's where the failing is occurring. But the framework itself is designed to be longer term. The difficulty is, how do you lock in that sort of long-term thinking and bind government? Like we don't allow that. Government doesn't want to be beholden to its predecessors. It should be free to make its decisions, appropriate decisions at the time. So that's a real challenge. But again, I think it's sort of, there is that ability for that long-term thinking, that long-term, addressing climate change, but there's the short-term thinkers, decision makers fall into the way.
A pātai here for Kiri from Tamatha Pō, tēnā koe, Councillor. How do we take Kiri's concept of mana being about agency and the power to act without it becoming about individual responsibility / personal carbon footprint?
Yeah, interesting actually. So the question is asking how we don't let, say, government off the hook by taking our own futures into our own hands. Is that kind of the...
Tams?
I think we need policies or strategies that are going to support small communities to be resilient, especially around alternative energies and food resilience. So they still have a role to play, but our communities can engage their own agency to make that happen for themselves.
Mark, pātai for you here. You've worked with ministers who are grappling with these decisions. How do we hold them to account with these decisions, as you said?
Just voting, turning up to the polls and voting. That's the real way. And being vocal, like the zero carbon bill. The reason that got through, and I don't think I'm sort of speaking out of school, but there was a lot of negotiation within government and with all the parties about that bill. And it was far more progressive than some wanted and far less progressive than others wanted. But that's the political process. But the reason that bill really got through was because of Climate Leaders Coalition, so businesses coming to government and saying, we don't care, but we know climate change is an issue. You need to make a decision and provide us long-term certainty so we can make decisions for our businesses, investment decisions or whatever, where we're going to operate. So businesses was really important. And, you can call it lobbying or whatever you want, but it was that massive influence on the government there. And it was hugely influential on the National Party and New Zealand First, who, could have just opposed that, but recognised that because the businesses, because their voters are behind it, they would be foolish not to support it. And the other really important one was the students striking, the marches. Like, they were huge impact because they were so reputationally, government had to listen to the young. They made so much noise. There was so much energy there that was the outward side, the pressure from the public on government to push that through and to take the lead on that. So, you can hold them into account by voting, but you're also, throughout the term, you've got to keep at your members. You've got to keep pushing them, and in a coordinated way. And you work in government, and many of you do here, or some of you do here. You can see how one very loud voice can have a really big impact on any of these issues.
Ilan, for you, is the cost relative to inaction rather than the status quo?
So the cost is the cost we are experiencing right now because of our past behavior, right? What we can do now is change the future costs. We can't change the cost we're experiencing now, and we're not going to be able to change the kind of extreme weather we are going to be experiencing in the next few years, but we can globally together change the cost of weather 10, 20 years from now. But what we can do is adapt right now so that those costs are less impactful on our communities, even in the very near future. Not by building stop banks in Westport, but doing something a bit more far-sighted than that. And that's sort of that issue of far-sightedness versus the short-sightedness of governments. We have to acknowledge the fact that we have a 3-year cycle for government, which means that we have an unusually short-term thinking in government here. We do have examples of other places where we have established mechanisms to account for that. So we have the Reserve Bank, for example, which is independent and sets policy without looking at these short-term considerations. We have the Climate Change Commission, and we have, I think, at least 2 commissioners sitting in the audience here. They don't have the same power that the Reserve Bank has, and maybe they should have a little bit more power to call government to account. There might be good reasons not to actually, have James set all policy in New Zealand, but still, I think we need to acknowledge that the Climate Change Commission gave some advice. The government chose to ignore it with very little implications. So we need to be, and part of that process is to force voters to call them to account, but that doesn't quite always work the way we want it to. So we need to put other mechanisms in place as well.
When we were developing that policy, like the idea behind providing the Climate Change Commission with the power to provide that advice, we honestly naively thought that if the government went against that, there would be an uproar and people would be upset and go, why is the government, not taking the advice of an independent, informed body? And it hardly got any coverage, So again, we're all at fault here.
Mm. And just on that, there's a pata here as well for you, Mark. Do you see banks and corporates being motivated by anything other than financial risk and penalties? And are you seeing a more genuine shift on that?
Yeah, so the reason businesses and financial institutions are responding to climate change generally, and remember there are corporate entities, there's probably three things. One is that like the board or the executive think that they've got a moral duty or a corporate responsibility to do something about it, and we certainly absolutely see that. And some of our New Zealand organisations have been held up internationally as exemplars in that space. The other ones are the ones that are under the mandatory regime, are required to report, and some of the organisations see that as just a compliance exercise. They completely misunderstand the process, but they see it as a compliance exercise. But most of them we see are driven by their shareholders, not shareholders, stakeholders, much broader than their shareholders. So I think they're just people, and as new generations come through, we're seeing far more women on boards, far more younger people making their way through to boards now. And absolutely, there's a big shift in the way that organisations are trying to address climate change, but they've got constraints too. You can't, as a director, just say, like, we're going to go full out and we're going to prioritise everything climate changey and not focus on our profits. Our legislation doesn't enable them to do that. And there are legal issues aligned with that. But I think since we've done things like mandatory reporting regimes, have emissions trading schemes in there, and made money a centre point of it, it's really caught the attention of financial institutions and corporates, and it's got them thinking. So that's made a behavioural change in itself, and I think there's momentum has developed from that.
Mm. Kiri, we'll have a couple more parts and then we'll wrap up. But Kiri, you've already kind of touched on this, but I do want to give you an opportunity to kind of open it up a bit more. How do we as a society move away from the purely economic framing of climate response towards what is actually valuable?
Okay, good question. How we value things is actually tied to our paradigm. And the paradigm that we are operating from is often the one we're given at birth by our parents and society. So we don't choose or opt into our paradigms. They're ones that we're immersed in from birth. So to change a paradigm is actually really, really hard, and changing paradigms are painful. They hurt because you're trying to deconstruct all the teachings and neuro pathways that have been formed. So my advice, I think, on that question is to embrace Te Ao Māori and let that paradigm flow through you to change your value system.
Because it can, like you talked kind of about that fear before, Mark, around, especially politically, but I do see in the public sector as well, we do see that these Māori concepts, although, making sure they're looked after, but when they are, they do apply, they can apply to everybody. Do you think that there is people becoming more open to that, non-Māori are becoming more open to that? Do you think we're going to, because all of this sort of stuff becomes a political football, especially in an election year, and we've come so far. Do you fear that we will kind of hit a bit of a wall of how much that will be taken on in terms of incorporating our paradigms, our Māori paradigms?
So we also need to be careful that we don't over-romanticise te ao Māori and Māori concepts, and that we don't get into a love affair with it, and don't engage in reality. Where was I going with that? What was the question?
Right. The question was, how do we make sure that people are open to looking and doing things in a Māori way while taking in Māori concepts, our paradigms, Māori paradigms, as you said, to be open to that in order to shift how we think about what we value. And in a year where it is used, race-based politics, it's used to spark fear and to stop people from being open to those particular concepts and understanding that from a Māori worldview. Are you worried that all of that progress that we are making is going to stop, or do you see us going in that direction?
I see us, we're going in that direction. Definitely as a nation, we are heading into let's call it a paradigm merge at this stage.
Better than a media merger.
And all of that overreaction is going to, let's say, die off. I study this quite a bit, how paradigms change. I've looked at the push and pull factors of New Zealand's paradigm twist, I call it. And the push factors are ones like compliance, regulation, law. Those are the push factors that help to change a paradigm. For example, the word kaitiaki, which first entered into our, let's say, discourse with the Resource Management Act in the 90s. Now that piece of legislation helped to disperse the word kaitiaki across the nation, into the everyday homes of New Zealanders. So that's a push factor. It was pushed, that paradigm concept was pushed down onto us. Then I look at pull factors. These are the things that we pull these concepts into our lives because we can see they're going to give us a benefit or an advantage or an opportunity. So we're seeing a lot more of the pulling of Māori concepts into organisations, by individuals, by families, by communities, to gain that advantage or opportunity from Māori concepts. So I look at how those push and pull factors dance around with each other, how they're iterative and,
Well, we've come to the end of this panel, but before we wrap up, I do want to just throw to each of you to give something, either a pātai, a question, or something that you want people to think about or take away from your kōrero. No pressure, Mark, I'll start with you.
I guess sort of harking back to what I've said, like how serious are we about dealing with this issue? And if you're really serious, then that behavioural change will start with you and not just pay lip service. Like, there's a cost to doing this, but you've got to really look at it and say, am I relying on someone else to do this, or am I going to do something about it? And we measure everything like in real emissions reductions. If it's not going to achieve an emissions reduction in the real economy, then I would say that you're just kidding yourself. Like, if you're serious about this, everything you need to do is focused on achieving those real emissions reductions.
And what rākau were you and why? What rākau were you and why? What tree were you and why?
It's a long story back to my childhood. So
cool. Okay, cool. Kiri kei a koe? Not the rākau thing at the end, but the inspirational quote now.
I think I'd like to leave everyone with a bit of a scenario, I guess. So I always think about, I live on a valley, it's about 14 kilometres long. And I think, what will happen? How will we live? How will we survive if this valley is cut off? And I use that scenario to help think about how we will feed ourselves, how we will live, how we will survive, what we should be growing, how we should be living in relation to each other. And so I guess I challenge you to think about your scenario. What happens if your environment is cut off? Nothing's getting in and nothing can get out. How will you survive? How will you live? What will life look like for you? So that's my scenario challenge I leave with you. And my tree is kānuka, Did anyone else choose the kānuka?
You're cheating your treasure hunt. Don't put your hand up.
Oh, there we go. I've got two fellow companions, kānuka companions. We've got some big commercial products coming out of our valley for kānuka, so wait for that media release.
Oh, kia ora, Kiri. Ilan.
Yeah, we talked a lot about the Maori worldview and how that can contribute to us. I'm a visitor here. You've heard my foreign accent. I'm in Judaism. We have I think a similar worldview that doesn't conflict at all with the Maori worldview. And one of our principal ideas is tikkun olam, which translates into fixing the world. And I think we have a duty to fix the world. In this case, what I see the problem is it doesn't, it's not a Maori worldview versus sort of a Judeo-Christian worldview, because, at least in my tradition, there is an equivalent. The problem we had was created recently in the way we structured our economies in the last 50 or so years, and that is, it's achievable to fix it. I don't think that we need to be despairing about it. We can fix it, and we can make sure that the costs of climate change are as low as we can make them, and we adapt to it, and we make sure that our grandchildren, I don't have any yet, but I'm putting pressure on my kids, that we make sure that our grandchildren are going to be in a world in which we haven't destroyed the environment, and I think that's perfectly achievable.
Stunning. And your tree and why?
My tree was Putakawa, because this morning there were 5 kaka birds on the Putakawa just outside my house, and I live in Mount Vic, so that's a success for Zealandia for reintroducing kakas into Wellington, which I really liked, and yeah, that's my tree.
Oh, stunning. Oh, well, Ngāti mihi kia koutou, thank you so much for your amazing kōrero and those beautiful insights. Ngāti mihi kia koutou. Kia ora. Go ahead with that stuff.